To understand what happened during the Second World War, you need to pay attention to the struggle for resources. All wars and world history have been about resources, but this war was different from other conflicts in history. To participate in the war, countries need to equip soldiers, produce tanks, bombs, and ships, and to do this without resources is quite difficult. Let's look at the economy of some participants at the very beginning of the war. Germany, France, and the UK are European countries that have historically been in direct conflict. A great military leap was made by Germany, which was disarmed after the First World War. France invested heavily in defense, and Britain resumed its naval building program. For comparison, let's look at GDP. From it, you can find out how much the country produced military equipment. Also important is the population, which determines how many people will be drafted into the troops. Territorial extent, it gives us an idea of the control over natural resources. And let's also mention GDP per capita. It allows you to understand how developed the economy is. The higher this figure, the better for the country. It may seem that Germany is stronger than Great Britain, but we need to take into account the entire British Empire. Then we get huge values, plus we take into account France, another colonial power. Thanks to the colonies, they could have a lot of resources, but many colonies have incredibly low GDP per capita, and therefore there was not much use for the warfare in these places. We can also look at the countries such as the Soviet Union and the United States. The first had oil and coal deposits in abundance, and the second had vast agricultural lands, a bunch of minerals and oil refineries. Now let's move on to the other side of the conflict. Japan is a small ambitious island state, and Germany and Italy were too late to the colonial division of the world. Germany in the war was counting on the plan of lightning war, Blitzkrieg. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact with the USSR guaranteed not only the absence of war on two fronts, but also the provision of oil supplies. The Germans then had to deal with the shortage of aluminum and iron, and to do this they invaded Norway, which not only provided an excellent place for the production of aluminum, but also provided Germany with access to Sweden, from which the Germans imported iron in huge quantities. Food was still needed to feed a multi-million-strong army, and France, which was one of the most fertile regions of Europe, was suitable for this. But then Germany started having problems. The battle for Britain began. On the night of August 25, 1940, German bombers mistakenly dropped their bombs on London. Winston Churchill suggested that this were a deliberate attack on the civilian population and ordered a retaliatory strike against Berlin. British bombers were ordered to hit commercial and industrial targets, but they also missed and dropped their bombs on the civilian targets, after which Hitler ordered the deliberate bombing of civilian targets in London. He wanted to break the will of the inhabitants of London and with it the empire itself. The ordinary citizen had to lose faith in the government's ability to protect him and break under constant threat, but this only served to rally the people. People who lost loved ones went to recruiting stations and went to military service. British factories continued to produce military equipment, so it was not possible to break the resistance of Britain to Germany, which ultimately led to the defeat of Germans in this battle. Another problem in Germany was related to oil. She had Romanian oil, but it was not enough, and Hitler decided to take a difficult path and attack the Soviet Union. The USSR possessed a huge amount of natural resources, a large population, and high GDP, but per capita GDP was quite low. This means that it had a less developed economy than many European powers. But the soldiers of the Soviet army rebuffed the Germans, first near Moscow and then in the North Caucasus, where the Germans went in the hope of getting the oil of Maikop and Grozny. Japan's situation was even worse, because before the war she mainly traded with the United States and understood that expansion in the Pacific Ocean would sooner or later lead to conflict with them. Japan had a chance to go for resources to Siberia through Mongolia, but the Soviet army stopped them. There was one more option left, to capture China and numerous islands in the Pacific Ocean. This idea was to capture the colonies of European countries that are already engaged in a war on the other half of the globe. From these colonies you could get oil that the Japanese lost when they were embargoed. But they were not only colonies of European countries but an American. Admiral Yamamoto calculated that if the United States entered the war, Japan will be able to win in 6 months. But if they fail to succeed in this period, they will lose. So the Japanese attacked the US Navy base on the Hawaii Islands, Pearl Harbor. And what is very interesting, by capturing these territories, the Japanese began to control almost 90% of the world's production of rubber, a key military material. World War I was the first industrial war, and World War II was the first scientific war, with things like radar, computers, the atomic bomb. Among these scientific advances were synthetic materials. Now, the United States too has become a participant in the global conflict. They had a GDP greater than that of all the major countries of the Nazi coalition combined. With the fall of France in 1940, it became clear that without resources from the United States, Britain wouldn't be able to resist Germany. But America was against any interference in the country's affairs. And in confirmation of this policy in 1930, the United States passed a law of neutrality, which said that the country wouldn't get involved in foreign wars and wouldn't even sell weapons to countries at war. But US President Franklin Roosevelt saw a threat that represented by Nazi Germany, and he found a way to get around his law. To do this, the British and French had to pay in cash and transport this money to the Americans, and those in return gave military assistance to these allies. But in 1940, Germany invaded France and started bombing British cities, and then Roosevelt obtained permission to sell destroyers in exchange for bases in the British colonies. Everyone considered the surrender of the British Empire inevitable, and the deal with destroyers in exchange for bases allowed us to place American bases in the British colonies so that these territories didn't fall into the hands of the Germans. But the British withstood the onslaught of Germany, and now the United States had to move on to longer-term planning. It was time for Lend-Lease, without which Great Britain would almost certainly have capitulated. The idea of Lend-Lease was very simple. The United States provided its allies with a huge amount of supplies and military equipment for the duration of the war, which after the end of the war had to be returned if possible or redeemed. Even 2,000 locomotives and 11,000 wagons were transferred to the Soviet Union from the United States to strengthen the railway infrastructure. And although another 9 months had passed from the beginning of Lend-Lease to the official entry of the state into the war, the numerous resources and industrial power of the United States had already been used to fight Germany. In general, if you want to understand the reasons for any political decisions taken during the Second World War, for start, take a look at how things are with resources.